I knew something was off the moment I stepped into my own apartment that evening. It wasn't anything obvious at first, nothing you could easily point to and say, there it is. But the air felt strange. Too quiet. Too rehearsed. After 59 years of living, you learn to recognize those little signals people think they hide well. Surprise! My daughter Caroline said a second too loudly as I entered the dining room. The table was beautifully set. Candles. White plates. My favorite wine, though I doubted anyone had actually remembered that it was my favorite. My son Mark stood by the window with his arms crossed, pretending to admire the skyline outside. My apartment overlooked the harbor in Seattle. I had worked 30 years as an accountant to afford this place. Every corner of it carried a memory. The couch I bought after my husband Daniel passed away, the old piano by the wall that I never quite learned to play well, the balcony where I watched the ferries move slowly across the water each evening. And now my children stood inside it like visitors inspecting a museum exhibit. "Happy birthday, Mom," Caroline said. She held a cake, chocolate with white frosting. My supposed favorite. Mark forced a smile. "Yeah, happy birthday." I thanked them and stepped closer to the table. Caroline carefully placed the cake down, turning it so the writing faced away from me. That alone made my stomach tighten. We sang the birthday song awkwardly, our voices bouncing against the high ceiling. When it ended, I leaned forward and blew out the candle. Caroline turned the cake toward me. The message written in thick pink frosting read, "1 year closer to assisted living." Caroline laughed immediately. Mark chuckled too, though less confidently. For a moment, I didn't react at all. I simply stared at the words as if they belonged to someone else's life. Caroline rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, Mom, it's a joke." A joke. 5 years ago, when Daniel died from a sudden stroke, my children had promised they would always be there for me. But promises age quickly. I forced a polite smile and cut the cake. My hands trembled slightly, though I hoped they didn't notice. "Funny," I said quietly. Neither of them noticed that I hadn't actually taken a bite. Only Maria did. Maria had been standing in the kitchen doorway, holding a tray with coffee cups. She had been working for me for a year now, originally hired after I slipped on wet pavement and fractured my wrist. Technically, she was a part-time caregiver, but she had become something else. Someone who listened. Someone who noticed things. Our eyes met for just a second. She didn't laugh. Caroline sat down and started eating her slice enthusiastically. "You know," she said casually, "Mark and I were talking earlier." "Of course you were." "About what?" I asked. Mark cleared his throat. "About the apartment." There it was. They had been circling this subject for months. "This place is huge for one person," Caroline said. 3 bedrooms. 2 bathrooms. It's just a lot to maintain.
I manage fine.
Caroline gave me the same smile she used when speaking to her children. Patient.
Condensing.
"Mom, you left the kettle on last week." "Once. And the pharmacy had to call you twice about your prescription." I picked it up. Mark finally joined the conversation. "We're just concerned." Concern. It's amazing how easily that word can disguise greed. I sat quietly while they continued talking. About senior communities. About safety. About how nice it would be to live somewhere with people my own age. I looked around my apartment while they spoke. The harbor lights were beginning to glow outside. The painting Daniel bought during our anniversary trip to Italy hung on the wall behind Caroline's head. The bookshelf Mark had helped me build when he was 16 stood near the door. Every object in that room told a story. Yet my children talked about it all, as if it were inventory. "So, we actually toured a place," Caroline said finally.
Of course you did.
"It's called Harbor Pines. Very respectable. Lots of activities."
How thoughtful, I said.
Maria quietly poured coffee for everyone. When she handed me my cup, she whispered softly, so only I could hear, You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to. It was such a simple sentence, but it felt like someone opening a window in a suffocating room. Caroline kept talking. And the best part is that once the apartment sells, the money could really help with your care. There it was, the real point. Not my happiness, not my comfort, the money. Mark shifted uncomfortably, but didn't disagree. I finally took a bite of cake. It tasted overly sweet. I'll think about it, I said. That seemed to satisfy them. They changed the topic. Work, their kids, vacation plans. But I barely listened. Instead, I watched them. Watched the way Caroline's eyes moved around the apartment. Measuring, calculating. Mark avoided looking at me altogether. After dinner, they left quickly. Caroline kissed my cheek. Just think about what we said, Mom. Mark gave me a quick hug. The door closed. Silence returned to the apartment. I walked to the balcony and stepped outside. The cold ocean air hit my face. Seattle at night was beautiful, glowing lights reflecting off the water like scattered gold. Daniel used to say the view alone was worth every sacrifice we made. Behind me, Maria quietly cleaned the kitchen. After a few minutes, she joined me on the balcony. You okay? She asked. I nodded slowly. They think I'm already gone. Maria didn't respond.
She didn't need to.
Because we both knew it was true. For months, my children had been preparing for a future where I wasn't really part of the decision anymore. The cake hadn't been a joke. It had been a message. And messages deserve responses. I went back inside and picked up my phone. There was one number I hadn't called in years, but I still remembered it. Thomas Green, my lawyer. He answered on the third ring. Sylvia Bennett? He said, surprised. Yes, Thomas. I looked around the apartment once more. The paintings, the piano, the harbor lights. My will needs to be updated. There was a short pause. Well, he said carefully, that sounds serious. It is. For the first time that night, I smiled. Very serious. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sun had barely begun to rise over Elliott Bay, and the soft gray light drifting through the curtains gave the apartment a calm, almost fragile atmosphere. For years, mornings had been my favorite time of day. The world felt slower then, less demanding. But that morning my thoughts were already racing before my feet even touched the floor. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, the same way I had done every morning for decades. Some routines become anchors in life. When everything else begins shifting, those small rituals remind you that you still control something. Maria was already awake. She had a habit of arriving quietly before I even noticed. When I stepped into the kitchen, she was standing by the stove, warming milk. Good morning, Sylvia, she said gently. Her voice carried none of the exaggerated cheerfulness people often use when speaking to older adults. She simply spoke to me the way she would speak to anyone else. Morning, I replied. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared out toward the harbor. The ferries were already moving across the water like slow white ghosts. People commuting. Students heading to class. Life continuing without asking anyone's permission. Maria placed the mug in front of me and sat across the table. You didn't sleep well, she said. It wasn't a question. No, I admitted. I took a sip of coffee and felt the warmth spread through my chest. For several minutes, we sat quietly. Maria had learned early that silence didn't make me uncomfortable. In fact, sometimes silence said more than conversation ever could. Finally, she spoke. Are you going to call your lawyer? I looked at her. I already did. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. And I'm meeting him tomorrow. Maria nodded slowly. She didn't look excited, or worried, or greedy the way Caroline would have if she knew about the meeting. Instead, she looked thoughtful. Sylvia, she said carefully, I hope you're not making decisions because of me. That sentence told me everything about her character. Anyone else in her position might have hoped I would leave her something. But Maria was trying to protect my relationship with my children, even though they had shown her nothing but disrespect. "This isn't about you," I said. She tilted her head. "Then what is it about?" I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. "It's about realizing something that took me far too long to understand." Maria waited patiently. "My children stopped seeing me as a person years ago." The words sounded strange even to my own ears. For most of my life, I had defended Caroline and Mark whenever anyone criticized them. I always told people they were good kids who had simply grown busy with their own lives. But the truth was harder. They had grown comfortable. Comfortable assuming I would always be there. Comfortable assuming everything I owned would eventually belong to them. Maria studied my face. "You raised them alone after your husband died," she said quietly. "Yes." The memories returned immediately. Daniel collapsing in the kitchen. The ambulance lights flashing against the windows. 2 teenagers standing in the hallway with terrified faces. After that night, life had turned into survival. I worked 2 jobs for almost 8 years. Accounting during the day, bookkeeping for small businesses at night. There were weeks when I barely slept. But I did it willingly, because I believed that one day my children would understand those sacrifices. "Did they know how hard you worked?" Maria asked. "They knew," I said. "But knowing and understanding are 2 different things." I finished my coffee and stood up, walking toward the large window in the living room. The apartment was quiet again. Sometimes I imagined I could still hear Daniel playing records on the old stereo. Sometimes I even caught myself turning my head when I thought I heard his footsteps. "You know," I said slowly, "Caroline didn't congratulate me when I bought this place." Maria looked surprised. "She didn't?"
No.
Her first question was about property taxes. Maria shook her head softly. "That must have hurt." "It did," I admitted. But I ignored it. Ignoring problems had become my specialty. Every time Caroline made another comment about retirement communities, every time Mark asked about my finances, every time they inspected the apartment like real estate agents, I told myself they were simply concerned. Until last night, the cake had stripped away the illusion. 1 year closer to assisted living. I walked back to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. The remaining half of the cake sat inside its box. I stared at it for a moment before closing the door again. "Are you going to tell them about the will?" Maria asked. "Not yet." "When?" "Soon." Maria nodded again, but didn't push further. Instead, she returned to preparing breakfast. Eggs, toast, sliced fruit. She always remembered the little details, like the fact that I preferred strawberries over blueberries. Caroline had never remembered things like that. After breakfast, I spent most of the morning going through old photo albums in the living room. I hadn't opened them in years. There was Caroline at 8 years old, holding a science fair trophy. Mark at 12, grinning with missing front teeth after winning a soccer game. Daniel standing between them, proud and exhausted. I ran my fingers slowly across the photographs. Where had the years gone? At noon, Maria reminded me about my appointment. "Do you want me to come with you tomorrow?" she asked. "No," I said. "This is something I need to do alone." She accepted that answer. That afternoon, I received 2 calls from Caroline. I didn't answer either. Then Mark called once. I let that go to voicemail too. When I listened later, his message was brief. "Hey Mom, just checking in. Caroline said you seemed upset yesterday." Upset. Such a harmless word for such a cruel situation. That evening the sunset painted the entire harbor in shades of gold and orange. I stood on the balcony watching the sky change colors while the wind tugged gently at my sweater. Maria joined me again. "Beautiful," she said. "Yes." We stood side by side, leaning against the railing. After a while she spoke quietly. "What will happen if they get angry?" I smiled faintly. "They will." And if they try to stop you? I looked out at the darkening water. They probably will. Maria seemed uneasy. I don't want to be the reason your family breaks apart. I turned toward her. You're not the reason. She hesitated. Then she asked something that surprised me. What would your husband say? For a moment my throat tightened. Daniel had always been direct, blunt sometimes, but he valued fairness above everything else. He would say, I replied slowly, that respect isn't automatic just because someone shares your blood. Maria nodded. I think he would be proud of you. Later that night, after Maria had gone home, I sat alone in the living room. The apartment felt different now. Not sad, not lonely, just quiet, peaceful in a way I hadn't felt for months. I picked up my phone again and checked the time. Tomorrow, I would meet with Thomas Green. Tomorrow the decision would become official. And once it did, everything would change. I looked around the apartment one more time. The piano, the paintings, the harbor lights beyond the glass. For decades this place had represented everything I had worked for. Now it represented something else. Freedom. I turned off the lights and prepared for bed. But before I went to sleep, one final thought crossed my mind. If my children believed I was too weak to make my own decisions, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The morning of the meeting arrived colder than usual, as if the city itself understood that something important was about to happen. A gray Seattle fog drifted slowly across the harbor, blurring the outlines of the ferries and the distant skyline. I stood on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the mist roll over the water. There are moments in life when you know a door is about to close behind you forever. That morning felt exactly like that. Maria arrived just after 8. She carried a small paper bag from the bakery downstairs and set it on the kitchen counter. Fresh croissants, she said. I smiled slightly. You're spoiling me. She shrugged. You have a big day. I sat at the table while she prepared breakfast. My appetite wasn't strong, but I forced myself to eat. Weakness was not something I could afford today. Have you decided what you'll wear? Maria asked. I nodded toward the living room chair. The navy dress. It was simple but elegant, the one I wore to Daniel's retirement dinner years ago. Maria walked over and picked up the silver brooch resting beside it. This one too, she said. That's Daniel's favorite. Exactly. While I dressed, Maria quietly cleaned the kitchen. I could hear the gentle sounds of dishes being stacked and water running from the sink. Strangely, the routine steadied my nerves. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, I didn't see an old woman preparing for a confrontation. I saw someone who had survived decades of challenges. Someone who had earned the right to be heard. At 10 o'clock, I left for Thomas Green's office. His building stood in one of Seattle's older neighborhoods, a quiet brick structure surrounded by tall maple trees. I had first met Thomas more than 30 years earlier, when Daniel and I bought our first house. Back then we were young and nervous about every financial decision. Now I was here for something far more personal. Thomas greeted me warmly as soon as I entered his office. Sylvia Bennett, he said with a wide smile. It's been too long. Yes, it has. We sat down across from each other at his large wooden desk. So, he said, adjusting his glasses. You mentioned on the phone that you wanted to update your will.
Ida.
He opened a folder and picked up his pen. What changes would you like to make? For a moment, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the decision, but because saying it aloud would make everything real. I want to remove my children as the primary beneficiaries of my apartment. Thomas stopped writing. I see. I want the property placed in a trust. His eyebrows lifted slightly. A trust? Yes. And who will control it? I will during my lifetime. Thomas nodded slowly. And afterward? I leaned forward slightly. I want the apartment used to support a housing program for students with children. He blinked. That's unexpected. I know. I explained everything then. The sacrifices Daniel and I had made. The years of working multiple jobs. The importance of education. And finally the dinner. The cake. The joke. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back in his chair for a moment. Well, he said carefully, this is certainly within your rights. Will my children try to challenge it? They might, but legally? If we structure the trust properly, he said, they will have very little ground to stand on. Relief washed over me. Thomas began drafting the documents immediately. The process took nearly 2 hours. When I finally signed the final page, the sound of the pen against paper felt strangely powerful. It was done. When I returned home that afternoon, Maria was preparing lunch. She looked up the moment I entered. Well, it's finished. Her eyes widened. You did it. Yes. She studied my face carefully. Do you feel okay? I considered the question. Yes, I said slowly. Actually,
Ido.
that evening I called Caroline and Mark. Come for lunch tomorrow, I told them. Both agreed immediately. Their voices carried the same polite curiosity I had heard for months. They thought the meeting would be about their plans for my future. They had no idea. The next day arrived bright and clear, the fog completely gone. Maria helped me prepare the table. Roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, warm bread, simple food, but beautiful. When the doorbell rang at noon, my heart pounded harder than I expected. Caroline entered first. She wore a tailored business suit, her expression confident. Mark followed behind her, looking slightly uncomfortable as always. Nice spread, Caroline said, glancing at the table. We sat down. The conversation began politely enough. Work updates. Caroline's children. Mark's new project at his company. But the tension hovered just beneath the surface. Finally, Caroline leaned back in her chair. So, she said, have you thought more about Harbor Pines? I folded my napkin carefully. Yes. Mark looked up. And I made a decision. Caroline smiled. I knew you would. I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip. Then I set it down. I updated my will yesterday. The room grew quiet. Caroline and Mark exchanged a quick glance. That's good, Mark said carefully. Caroline nodded. Very responsible. I've placed the apartment in a trust. Caroline's smile faltered. A trust? Yes. Mark frowned slightly. What kind of trust? One that will provide housing support for students raising children while attending community college. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Caroline laughed. Oh, Mom, very funny. I'm not joking. Her laughter stopped instantly. You're serious? Yes. Caroline's face turned pale. You're giving away the apartment? I'm using it to help people who need it. Mark leaned forward. Mom, that place is worth almost $700,000. I know. You can't just give it away. I already did. Caroline pushed her chair back sharply. This is insane. Mark ran his hand through his hair. Mom, why would you do this? I looked at them both. Because finally, after months of being treated like a problem to manage, I was done being managed. Because it's my apartment, I said calmly. And my decision. Caroline's voice rose. This is about that stupid cake, isn't it? It's about much more than that. You're punishing us. No, I said quietly. I'm protecting myself. The room fell silent. Outside the harbor, water glittered in the sunlight. Inside my dining room, the truth finally stood between us. And none of us could pretend it wasn't there anymore. For several seconds after my words settled in the air, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Caroline stood frozen beside her chair, staring at me as if I had just confessed to a crime. Mark looked between us, clearly trying to decide which side of the situation he was supposed to stand on. Outside the window, the harbor glittered peacefully under the afternoon sun, completely unaware that my family was quietly falling apart inside the dining room. "You're serious?" Caroline finally said. Her voice had lost all warmth. It sounded sharp now, almost brittle. "Yes," I replied calmly. "You're giving the apartment away to strangers. I'm using it to help people who need a chance." Caroline let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "People always need chances, Mom. That doesn't mean you hand over everything you own." Mark finally spoke. "Maybe we should slow down and talk about this." But Caroline was already shaking her head. "No," she said firmly. "We need to talk about this right now." She turned toward me again, her eyes burning with anger. "Do you realize how crazy this sounds?" "I realize exactly what it sounds like. You're throwing away your children's inheritance." The word inheritance hung in the room like a bad smell. For years they had both pretended money wasn't part of the conversation. Now the truth had finally slipped out. "I'm not throwing anything away," I said. "I'm deciding how to use what belongs to me." Caroline folded her arms. "You're not thinking clearly." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Caroline?" But she ignored him. "Mom, this isn't like you." I felt something inside me harden. "You're right," I said. "It isn't." For decades, I had been the quiet one in the family, the one who avoided conflict, who made peace whenever arguments started, who apologized even when I wasn't the one who should have been apologizing. But something about hearing my own daughter question my sanity had flipped a switch deep inside me. "I spent 30 years building that life." I continued slowly. "Your father and I sacrificed almost everything to make sure you and Mark had opportunities we never had." Caroline rolled her eyes. "Oh, please, here we go again." Mark frowned at her. "Caroline." "No, let her finish," she snapped. I looked directly at my daughter. "When your father died, I worked 2 jobs to keep this family afloat. I paid for your college. I paid for Mark's college. I helped you with your first home down payment." Caroline shrugged. "That's what parents do." "Yes," I said quietly. "It is. But parents don't expect to be treated like inconvenient obstacles later." Mark looked down at the table. Caroline leaned forward. "We are trying to help you. By sending me to a retirement home, we're trying to make sure you're safe."
I ser det her.
"From what?" Her mouth opened, then closed again. Mark tried to soften the moment. "Mom, you have to admit that living alone can be difficult as people get older." "I managed just fine." "You forgot your doctor's appointment last month." "I rescheduled it." "You left the stove on." "Once." Caroline raised her hands dramatically. "That's exactly what we mean. You keep minimizing things. And you keep exaggerating them." She stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking another language. "You're being manipulated," she said finally. I felt Maria tense behind me.
What do you mean by that?
I asked. Caroline turned toward the kitchen doorway, where Maria stood quietly. "Don't pretend this decision has nothing to do with her." Maria's face went pale. "Caroline," Mark said warningly. "No," she continued. "We all know what's happening here." I stood up slowly. "Be careful," I said. Caroline ignored the warning. "She moved in here, started helping with things, and suddenly you're changing your will? That's not suspicious to you." Maria stepped forward nervously. "I never asked for anything." Caroline snapped her head toward her. "No one was talking to you." That was the moment my patience finally broke. "Enough." My voice cut through the room like a blade. Caroline blinked, surprised by the tone. "You will not speak to her that way in my home. She's not family. She treats me better than family." Caroline stared at me, stunned. Mark rubbed his forehead. "This is getting out of control." "No," I said calmly. "This is the first honest conversation we've had in years." Caroline's eyes narrowed. You're choosing a stranger over your own children. I'm choosing respect. You're being dramatic. Am I? I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the empty cake box from the night before. I had kept it intentionally. I placed it in front of Caroline. She looked down at the faded pink frosting message. For the first time, she looked slightly uncomfortable. It was a joke, she muttered. It was cruel. You're too sensitive. I leaned closer. Tell me honestly, Caroline. When you look at me now, do you see your mother? She hesitated. Then she said nothing. That silence told me everything. Mark spoke quietly. Mom, maybe we should talk to a specialist. Just to make sure everything is okay.
I stared at him.
A specialist? A cognitive evaluation or something like that. The words felt like ice in my chest. You think I'm losing my mind? That's not what I said. But it's what you meant. Caroline nodded immediately. It wouldn't hurt to check. In that moment, I realized something painful. They had already decided what story they believed. No amount of reasoning would change it. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. If you believe I'm incapable of making decisions, I said slowly, you're free to pursue whatever legal steps you think are necessary. Mark looked alarmed. Mom, that's not what we want. Isn't it? Caroline grabbed her purse angrily. This conversation is pointless. She walked toward the door, but paused before leaving. You'll regret this, she said coldly. Then she walked out. Mark remained standing in the middle of the room. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at me with tired eyes. Mom, things don't have to end like this. I felt a wave of sadness pass through me. They didn't have to begin like this either. He nodded slowly. Then he left as well. The door closed. The apartment became silent again. Maria approached cautiously. I'm so sorry, she said softly. I sat down at the table, suddenly exhausted. You have nothing to apologize for. She sat across from me. They won't stop. I know. Outside, the harbor breeze rattled the balcony railing slightly. For years, I had been afraid of losing my children. But now I understood something important. Sometimes the only way to keep your dignity was to stop begging people to value it. I stood up and walked to the window. The sunlight shimmered across the water. For the first time in a long while, I felt strangely calm, because one thing had become perfectly clear. The real battle had only just begun. The next morning, the apartment felt unusually quiet, but not in the heavy way it had after Caroline and Mark left the day before. This silence felt different. It felt like the calm that follows a storm when the air clears and everything looks slightly sharper than before. I woke early again, long before the sun rose over the harbor. For several minutes, I simply lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous day in my mind. Caroline's anger, Mark's uneasy attempts to calm things down, the moment when they both realized I was no longer going to follow the script they had written for me. For years I had feared that moment, but now that it had happened, I didn't feel broken. I felt strangely steady. When I finally walked into the kitchen, Maria was already there preparing coffee. The smell filled the apartment, warm and comforting. She looked up as I entered. How are you feeling today? I considered the question carefully. Tired, I said honestly, but not regretful. Maria nodded slowly. I was worried about you after they left. I know. She placed a mug in front of me and sat down across from the table. For a few moments we sat quietly again, listening to the distant sound of seagulls outside and the faint rumble of the first ferry leaving the harbor. Do you think they'll come back? She asked. Yes, I said. Maria raised an eyebrow. You sound certain. I know my children. Caroline never accepted defeat easily. If she believed she was entitled to something, she would fight until the very end. Mark was different. He avoided confrontation whenever possible, but he rarely opposed Caroline openly. I'm expecting lawyers next, I said calmly. Maria sighed. I hate that this has become a battle. So do I. But deep down I had known it would. Later that morning I called Thomas Green again. I explained what had happened at lunch and asked him one simple question. What should I expect? Thomas didn't hesitate. If your daughter decides to challenge the trust, she may try to claim that you're being influenced or that you're not capable of making financial decisions. In other words, I said, she'll try to prove I'm mentally unfit. That's the most common strategy. I leaned back in my chair. Then I'll take a formal evaluation. There was a pause on the phone. You're sure about that? Yes. If you pass it, Thomas said, it will make any legal challenge extremely difficult. That's exactly what I want. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. The days that followed were tense, but quiet. Caroline sent several long text messages filled with accusations and emotional appeals. Mark sent 2 emails asking if we could talk. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I focused on preparing the next stage of my decision. The idea for the scholarship program had come to me unexpectedly during my meeting with Thomas. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. Daniel had always believed that education was the most powerful investment a person could make. Years ago, we had helped a young nursing student who was raising a child on her own. She had lived in our spare room for almost a year while finishing her final semester. She now worked as a pediatric nurse. Daniel used to say that helping one person succeed could change an entire family's future. I wanted the apartment to do exactly that. A week later, I sat in the quiet office of Dr. Rebecca Langford, the specialist Thomas had recommended. The evaluation lasted nearly 2 hours. Memory tests, logic puzzles, questions about finances, current events, and daily routines. Dr. Langford was polite, but professional. She didn't treat me like a fragile object, which I appreciated. When the session finally ended, she closed her notebook and looked at me with a small smile. Mrs. Bennett, she said, your cognitive results are excellent. I felt relief, though I had never truly doubted the outcome. Would you mind writing that in a formal report? I asked. She laughed softly. I already planned to. 3 days later, Thomas called again. Good news, he said. What happened? Your daughter contacted my office. My heart tightened slightly. And she asked about contesting the trust. That doesn't surprise me. But once she learned about the evaluation results, she decided not to pursue it. I closed my eyes for a moment. So it's over? For now, he said. That evening, as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, Mark stood in the hallway. He looked nervous, almost like a teenager again. Can I come in? I stepped aside. He walked slowly into the living room and looked around the apartment. His eyes paused on the piano, the balcony doors, the photographs on the wall. I haven't really looked at this place in years, he said quietly. That's true. He sat down and rubbed his hands together. Caroline's furious. I assumed she would be. She thinks you're punishing us. I sat across from him. That's not what I'm doing. Mark sighed. I know. I waited. He finally looked at me. Mom, I think we forgot something.
What?
That you're still the same person who raised us. The words caught me off guard. For a long time, he continued, we kept talking about what was safest, what was practical, but we never actually asked what you wanted. I studied his face carefully. And now, I'm trying to listen. The moment felt fragile, but real. I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight, I said. I know. He stood up and walked toward the balcony window. The view really is incredible, he said. It always has been. 2 months later, the apartment officially became part of the Bennett Education Housing Trust. The first family moved in shortly afterward. A young couple studying at the local community college with 2 small children. The father was training to become a nurse. The mother was studying business administration. I stood in the living room watching the children run excitedly toward the balcony doors. Their laughter filled the space in a way I hadn't heard in years. Maria stood beside me. "Are you sure about this?" she asked gently. I nodded. Yes. I had purchased a smaller condominium nearby. It still overlooked the harbor, though from a slightly different angle. The view was still beautiful, and the apartment that had once represented my life's work now represented something larger. Opportunity.
Hope.
A future that belonged to someone else. That night, sitting alone in my new home, I cut myself a slice of chocolate cake, the kind I had always preferred.
No candles.
No jokes written in frosting. Just quiet. I took a bite and looked out at the dark water beyond the balcony. For the first time in a long while, I felt something simple and powerful settle inside me.
Peace.
Because in the end, the apartment had never truly been about property or money.
It had been about choice.
And for the first time in years, the choice had been entirely mine.